Hatshepsut, royal daughter, royal wife, pharaoh, and her court. This lecture, originally presented to the Egyptian Studies Society in 2019, was updated and re-recorded in 2021. Here's what I'll cover today. Hatshepsut's family, the first three Thutmose kings. Hatshepsut's path to power, from princess to queen to regent to king. The significant members of her royal court, some of her important building projects, her death and burial, and finally, I'll look at evidence that her mummy has been found. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt 3,500 years ago, between about 1479 and 1458 BCE. This extraordinary woman achieved much during her life, and her amazing accomplishments have only recently been realized. Her reign was almost forgotten, but she deserves recognition with the likes of Helen of Troy, Joan of Arc, Florence Nightingale, Cleopatra, and of course the intrepid Amelia Peabody. Her name means hat, foremost of, sheps, noble, set, ladies, foremost of noble ladies. So, who was Hatshepsut and where did she come from? Her story begins in the reign of King Ahmose, the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. His name in Egyptian means Ea, the moon, Mes is born, Ea Mes, or in English, Ahmose. He completed the conquest and expulsion of the Hyksos invaders, those foreigners who had ruled Egypt for the previous 100 years. Ahmose was hailed as a conquering hero, and his reign marked the beginning of the glorious days of Egypt's new kingdom empire. Ahmose's chief wife, Ames Nefertari, became the first god's wife of Amun. The god's wife was the second most powerful position in Karnak Temple, answerable only to the high priest and pharaoh himself. The so-called donation stela of Ahmose was found broken and used as filler in the third pylon at Karnak. It declared King Ahmose purchased from the Karnak Temple priests a position called the god's wife of Amun for his wife Ames Nefertari. Amun, by the way, is the god shown here with the two-feathered crown. The god's wife of Amun spied on the temples and gave the early 18th dynasty kings a check on the power of the priesthood. In ancient Egyptian, God's wife is Hemet Necher. The next king was Ahmose's son Amenhotep I, whose name means the god Amun. Hetep is pleased. Amenhotep led his army on campaigns south into Nubia and west into Libya. He ordered improvements to Karnak Temple and built his mortuary temple in the west bank at Deir el Bahri, but it was later destroyed when Hatshepsut built her mortuary temple on top of it. When Amenhotep's only son, Amenemhat, died while still young, this king left no male heirs to take the throne. After ruling for 21 years, Amenhotep I died in 1504 BCE. His tomb has never been located. A commoner, 29-year-old General Thutmose, was appointed the next king, perhaps because his wife Ames was of royal descent. Thutmose's birth name, Jehudi Mes, means Mes, child of, the god Jehudi. Thoth was the Greek name for the ibis-headed Egyptian god Jehudi. The Romans called Thoth Thutmose, which is where our modern pronunciation came from. On becoming king, every pharaoh took on a throne name. This king's throne name was Aa, Keper, Ka, Re, or great is the manifestation of the soul of Re. Re, sometimes pronounced Ra, was the sun god shown as a solar disk. At Karnak, Thutmose I added columns and statues in the east courtyard, and he extended the temple toward the Nile River by building the fourth and fifth pylons. This created the WADJET hall, and in front of the fourth pylon, Thutmose placed two obelisks. He also surrounded the temple with a sandstone wall. Thutmose and his wife Ames had two daughters. The oldest was named Hatshepsut, born around 1506 BCE. Unfortunately, there's no known depictions of Hatshepsut as a child. However, her younger sister, NEFERURE, is shown here. So, upon Thutmose I's succession, little Hatshepsut and NEFERURE became princesses in Egypt's royal court. In Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el Bahri, her mother, Queen Ames, is shown as a pregnant woman being led off to the birthing chamber by Khnum and Heket. She's hard to make out here, but Heket was the frog-headed goddess. Here's a depiction of a woman giving birth at Deir Temple. In ancient Egyptian, the queen was called Hemet Nesut, or king's wife. Notice her vulture headdress. The vulture headdress was a symbol of the royal queens of ancient Egypt. It represents Nekbet, one of the two ladies who protected Egypt. The other lady was Wadjet, the cobra goddess. This vulture headdress was worn by Theda Bara in the 1917 movie Cleopatra. It was sold in 2008 for over $10,000. Hatshepsut's nurse, Sitre, looked after her when she was a baby. This is a life-size statue of Sitre found in Hatshepsut's Mortuary Temple. It shows Sitre with a miniature Hatshepsut on her lap. Inscribed on the statue is, and I quote, "Chief Nurse Sitre, who nurtured the mistress of the two lands," end quote. The statue is badly damaged, and only young Hatshepsut's legs have been preserved. If complete, it would have been similar in appearance to this statue of Pepi II on his mother's knee. Here's an ostracon showing a woman nursing. It was found in the workers' village at Deir el Medina. MAAT is female nurse in Egyptian. You might be wondering where the royal families lived. Well, these pharaohs had three main palaces in their capital city of Thebes, modern-day Luxor. First, the king's palace. Second, a chief queen's palace. And third, a harem palace. Hatshepsut and her siblings would have grown up in the harem palace. A new kingdom harem, or per henti, was a set of rooms facing a courtyard which usually contained a pool surrounded by a high wall. Ancient Egyptian harems housed women, servants, children, royal nurses, and royal tutors. They had schoolrooms, storerooms, cooking and dining facilities, and a chapel. But unfortunately, the exact location of Thutmose I's palaces have been lost in the sands of Egypt. While still a young girl, probably around 9 or 10 years of age, Hatshepsut inherited the position of God's wife of Amun. The daily duties of the God's wife included being purified with the temple priests of Amun in the sacred lake at Karnak, offering the god his meals, shaking the sistrum during celebrations, and conducting liturgies in the holiest parts of the temple. During special occasions, the god's wife burned wax effigies of the enemies of Egypt, and in her role as the god's hand, touched Amun's statue intimately. In addition to her younger sister, NEFERURE, Hatshepsut had three brothers, probably all the offspring of Thutmose I's secondary wife, Mut-Nofret. Hatshepsut's oldest stepbrother, Amun-Mose, was initially the crown prince, but he died after a few years, and her second oldest stepbrother, Wajmose, became crown prince, but he too died shortly thereafter. So, the next in line, Hatshepsut's young stepbrother, Thutmose II, was left as heir to the throne. There's also no known depictions of Thutmose II as a child. But soon after young Thutmose II became the crown prince, his father, Thutmose I, died. Thutmose I's body was mummified, wrapped in linen bandages, placed in these wooden coffins, and with due ceremony interred in his tomb. This mummy was found in the DB 320 Royal Mummy Cache, where the priests of the 21st dynasty hid the bodies of the pharaohs, after discovering their tombs were being robbed and desecrated. Although this mummy was tagged as Thutmose I, his coffins had been reinscribed for a 21st dynasty king. So previously there was doubt as to whether or not this mummy was King Thutmose. Recent DNA tests on the Thutmose kings, however, confirm that this really is Thutmose I. Since the time of the Old Kingdom, mortuary temples were constructed for the funeral of the pharaoh and as a place to conduct memorial services in perpetuity to honor the dead king. Ancient Egyptians called them Hut Ent He Renpet, or literally, house for millions of years. Thutmose I's mortuary temple, named Kenem Ankh, or United with Life, was probably located somewhere at Deir el Bahri. It's never been found. Like Amenhotep I's mortuary temple, Thutmose I's temple may have been incorporated into or demolished when Hatshepsut's temple was built. Thutmose I's original burial may have been in KV20, the first tomb in the Valley of the Kings. I'll say more about this a bit later. But not all scholars agree that Thutmose was originally buried here, as he was later reburied in tomb KV38 by his grandson. On becoming the new king, Thutmose II took on the throne name of Aa Keper En Re, or Great is the manifestation of Re. If you look at a king's name in hieroglyphs, you can usually tell which type of name it is. The birth name is often prefixed with Sa Re, son of Re, shown by the hieroglyph for the duck Sa and the sun Re. The throne name is usually prefixed with Nesut Biti, which means king of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolized by the sedge plant and the bee. According to Thutmose I architect in Eni, Thutmose II was just a hawk in the nest when he became king. In the tradition of the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut, as the oldest daughter of the previous king, was married to Thutmose II. Hatshepsut would have been about 14 years of age, and her new husband a couple of years younger. Their mother, Ames, probably functioned as regent to the new king for the first few years, until he was old enough to rule on his own. On this stela, now in Berlin, Thutmose II, his regent, Queen Ames, and Hatshepsut are shown paying tribute to the god Re Harakti. As Thutmose II's older sister wife and God's wife of Amun, Hatshepsut must have taken on more responsibility managing the affairs of state than most ancient Egyptian queens would have. Even though King Thutmose II was still a teenager, Egypt could defend herself. During his reign, a military campaign in Nubia was carried out, and another conflict in Syria was led by General Ahmose-pen-Nekbet. But by and large, Thutmose II ruled during a period of peaceful prosperity, sandwiched in between the military conquests of his father, Thutmose I, and Thutmose II's own son, Thutmose III. During his reign, Thutmose II erected a new pylon of Karnak in front of his father's fourth pylon and walled in this area to create his festival court. The court linked the two east-west and north-south processional routes, and it enclosed the obelisk of Thutmose I, the white chapel of Senusret I, and the limestone chapel of Amenhotep I. The ambitious constructions of her husband and her father would inspire Hatshepsut's own great projects, but more about this later. Hatshepsut had three major accomplishments during her years as Thutmose II's queen. She built her queen's tomb, she gave birth to their daughter NEFERURE, and she advanced her steward SENENMUT to prominent positions. Soon after becoming queen, Hatshepsut began construction on the difficult-to-access cliff tomb in the Wadi Siket Teket Zayed, a couple of miles west of Deir el Bahri. Here's a view of the wadi. Even today, the site of this tomb is difficult to reach. The cliff there is almost 400 feet high, and the tomb opening is over 200 feet above the valley floor. In 1916, Howard Carter discovered the tomb from the cliff face above when he found a rope dangling off the side. Hearing tomb robbers working below, he pulled up their rope and waited for the authorities to arrive and arrest the robbers. On entering the tomb, Carter found it full of debris, which was cleared over several days. The only artifacts found, however, were a few potsherds and a large quartzite sarcophagus with its lid. The sarcophagus had been made for Queen Hatshepsut, the first stone sarcophagus used for a New Kingdom royal burial. When the tomb was abandoned, her unused sarcophagus was left in place. Its inscription says, and I quote, "The grand princess, great in favor and grace, mistress of all lands, royal daughter, royal sister, great royal wife, lady of the two lands, Hatshepsut." End quote. Hatshepsut's daughter, NEFERURE, seems to have been born around 1485 BCE. She was the only surviving child of Hatshepsut and Thutmose II. Since the king and queen were often busy traveling the breadth of Egypt, other caregivers were involved in raising their children. At that time, royal children were raised with the assistance of royal nurses. Women who held the title of royal nurse, MAAT, Nesut, were wet nurses and infant care specialists. Here are two depictions of ancient Egyptian women nursing children. The statue on the left is of Isis nursing Horus. The drawing on the right, from the Amarna royal tomb, shows a wet nurse with Nefertiti's daughter, Mekhet-Aten. Men who held the title of royal nurse, Mena Nesut, were tutors and mentors for the children of the king. NEFERURE's first tutor was General Ahmose-pen-Nekbet, who had served under several of the preceding pharaohs and was held in great esteem. NEFERURE's next tutor was SENENMUT, one of King Ahmose's sons. NEFERURE's final tutor was SENENMUT, steward of the god's wife, Hatshepsut. In addition to marrying Hatshepsut, Thutmose II also married Iset, who became a secondary wife, and she had a son named Thutmose III. The infant Thutmose III was therefore both Hatshepsut's nephew and stepson. To better understand the life of Hatshepsut, I'll briefly mention some of the royal court officials who served during the reign of Thutmose II. Many of these men had previously held important positions under Amenhotep I and Thutmose I. Some were related to the king, but a few were commoners who rose up through the ranks of positions of wealth and power. Mel Brooks commented in his 1981 movie, The History of the World, "It's good to be king." But in ancient Egypt, it was also true that it was good to work for the king. In the next few slides, I'll outline some of the achievements of these four nobles. During Thutmose II's reign, the vizier of the south was Amenhotep. The role of vizier, or jati in ancient Egyptian, was equivalent to prime minister or president in modern-day terms. Viziers were responsible for the agencies supervising agriculture, land surveying, taxation, the treasury, the census, judges, the police and military, and the planning and building of monuments, tombs, roads, dams, and canals. They had a lot of responsibility. Amenhotep's children included Usur-Amun and Neferuere, who became the next two viziers. Amenhotep's wife was also the sister of the mayor of Thebes, the architect Eneni. Eneni's career spanned several pharaohs, Amenhotep I to Thutmose III. At Karnak, Eneni built Amenhotep I's limestone gate, a said festival structure, and limestone and alabaster chapels. He then constructed Thutmose I's fourth pylon, erected two obelisks, and added numerous courts and statues, and built the original WADJET hall. He was also promoted to mayor of Thebes during this time. During Thutmose II's reign, at Karnak, Eneni built the new pylon, walled in the festival court, and worked on numerous building projects throughout Egypt. I previously mentioned Neferure's first tutor, General Ahmose Pen Nekbet. For bravery, he had been awarded the Gold of Honor by Amenhotep I, and both Thutmose I and II. Thutmose II appointed him overseer of the seal, first royal herald, and tutor of the king's daughter, Neferure. On the walls of his tomb at El-Kab, Ahmose Pen Nekbet claims, and I quote, "For me, the god's wife, the great king's wife, Hatshepsut, repeated favors. I brought up her eldest daughter, the princess Neferure, while she was still a child at the breast." End quote. I'm sure many of you have heard of this next royal official, Senenmut, whose name means mother's brother. He was the son of a judge named Ramose and his wife Hap-Nefer from the Upper Egyptian town of Armant. He's known from many block statues with Neferure, who is shown here peeking out from under Senenmut's cloak. Senenmut advanced through several administrative positions during the reign of Thutmose II, such as royal tutor and steward of the house. He would go on to become a key player in Hatshepsut's court. I'll have more to say about him later. Thutmose II died unexpectedly in 1479 BCE, after only some 13 years on the throne. Hatshepsut was about 27 years old at the time, and their daughter Neferure was around 6 years of age. These dates are disputed by some scholars who believe Thutmose II only ruled between 3 and 7 years. Thutmose II's Mortuary Temple was located in the area now called Medinat Habu. The temple is completely ruined. Thutmose II's burial tomb has never been found. It could have been somewhere in the Theban hills, or it could have been one of the anonymous tombs in the Valley of the Kings, whose decoration has been lost. Or it could still be undiscovered elsewhere. The 21st dynasty priests also moved Thutmose II's mummy to the DB 320 Royal Mummy Cache, where it remained until discovered in 1881. Just like Thutmose I, Thutmose II's mummy had been placed in a reused coffin. After Thutmose II died, his 2-year-old son Thutmose III was too young to rule alone, so Hatshepsut was appointed his regent. Queen regent in ancient Egyptian language was Iti Et, literally female sovereign. Hatshepsut was probably chosen as regent because of her royal lineage. Her father was the previous king, and her mother was granddaughter of Pharaoh Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty. 4 preceding queens had also been regents: Tedasheri, mother of second Enretau, Ahotep, mother of Ahmose, Amiz Nefertari, mother of Amenhotep I, and Amiz, Hatshepsut's mother, regent of Thutmose II. Her appointment to regent began Hatshepsut's rise to power. For the next 7 years, she effectively ran Egypt. Adopting the title of co-ruler, she portrayed herself not as a queen, but as a woman wearing a pharaonic headdress. During this time, Thutmose III's education continued, and Hatshepsut made sure ministers were appointed, building projects were completed, and that the administration ran smoothly. During this co-rule, Hatshepsut continued as God's wife of Amun, retaining the wealth and power of this office. This graffiti, carved by Senenmut at Aswan, commemorates the transport of 2 obelisks to Karnak, previously quarried for Thutmose II before he died. In the 3rd column from the left, Hatshepsut is called King's daughter, King's sister, Great King's wife. This dates it to the time Hatshepsut was Thutmose II's wife. Here are Hatshepsut and Senenmut's names. There's a problem though. After Senenmut died is the epithet Ma'aheru, which means true of voice, a synonym for dead, but he wasn't dead yet. So perhaps someone else added this title after he died? It's a mystery. 7 years into Thutmose III's reign, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, and Thutmose III's status was reduced to co-ruler. Upon her accession to kingship, Hatshepsut took on the throne name of Ma'at Ka-Re, or Truth is the soul of Re. And she added Kenemet Amun, united with Amun, to her birth name. Hatshepsut must have had the support of the high officials around Thebes. As God's wife, she had worked with Amun's high priest Hapi-Seneb, and her close advisors like Senenmut and Ahmose-Pen-Nekbet had everything to gain by her rise in power. The reaction of the nobles in other parts of Egypt, however, may not have been quite so supportive. Hatshepsut commanded, and I quote, "He who will praise me, he will live, but he who will speak evil of me, he will die," end quote. This threat seems to have worked, as there is absolutely no evidence of an attempted insurrection, rebellion, or a coup during Hatshepsut's reign. Well, what did Thutmose III do about Hatshepsut's power grab? The short answer is nothing. He was only about 9 years old when Hatshepsut declared herself king. Thutmose III seems to have spent several years being tutored by temple priests before being sent to army training at about 14 years of age. It seems that Thutmose was content, at least during his teenage years, to let Hatshepsut take care of the administrative duties of the king. Now let's take a look at the relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III during her years as king. Thutmose III's throne name, the one with the sedge plant and the bee, was Men Keper Re, or lasting as the manifestation of Re. Thutmose III built over 50 temples during his reign, and his cartouche can be found all over Egypt. Upon her accession, Hatshepsut assumed the title of Nasut Bedi, king, and dressed in male attire, often with a false beard. Thutmose III was downgraded to co-ruler. Here's a scene from the Red Chapel. The inscription over her figure on the left reads, "King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ma'at Ka-Re, given life forever." The inscription over Thutmose III's figure on the right simply says, "The good God, Men-Keper Re, given life forever." Hatshepsut has presented herself here as the legitimate king, and Thutmose III is portrayed behind her without a kingly title. Should I say usurper? NEFERURE was probably about 13 years of age when her mother became king. Upon her accession, Hatshepsut gave up the title of God's wife of Amun and passed it down to NEFERURE. As the oldest daughter of King Thutmose II and sister of Thutmose III, NEFERURE was, of course, expected to marry her half-brother. Although no record has been found that NEFERURE married Thutmose III, on 2 depictions the name Satia is listed as a wife of Thutmose III. Her name seems to have been carved over that of NEFERURE, the original name depicted as wife. Initially, Satia was the daughter of NEFERURE's tutor. Satia was the daughter of NEFERURE's tutor, Ahmose-Pen-Nekbet, and his wife wet nurse Ipu. It's also speculated that NEFERURE was the mother of Thutmose III's eldest son, Amenemhat. Amenemhat predeceased his father, however, and it was another son, Amenhotep II, who succeeded Thutmose III as king. What we know for certain, however, is that following her mother's accession to the throne, NEFERURE had an unusual role for a royal princess. She took on the duties of a queen in public life and was given the titles Lady of Upper and Lower Egypt and Mistress of the Two Lands. NEFERURE's tomb is located in the Wadi Gabanat el Karud, just west of Hatshepsut's queen's tomb. Also nearby is the tomb of Thutmose III's 3 foreign wives. Soon after becoming king, Hatshepsut began extensive construction projects both around Luxor and throughout Egypt and Nubia. There isn't time to talk about every monument, but I'll cover these highlights. Shortly after declaring herself king, Hatshepsut began work on her royal tomb. Her king's tomb, now designated KV-20, was perhaps the first tomb constructed in the remote Valley of the Kings. In 1903, Howard Carter discovered the tomb's foundation deposit, which named Hatshepsut as the tomb's owner. This tomb cuts through some very bad rock, steeply descending and turning down to the burial chamber almost 700 feet from the entrance. It was probably originally built for Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I, and then a second burial chamber was added by Hatshepsut for her burial as well. Howard Carter cleared out the collapsed rubble in the burial chamber in 1920 and discovered 2 large quartzite sarcophagi. They were both empty. The first sarcophagus, now in Cairo, was inscribed for King Hatshepsut. It was decorated with 2 WADJET eyes and the gods Nephthys, Anubis, and Isis. The second sarcophagus, now in Boston, was originally inscribed for King Hatshepsut, but it was later recarved for Thutmose I. It seems the inside of the sarcophagus was chipped out and enlarged to make room for the 3 nested coffins that Thutmose was originally buried in. The site chosen for Hatshepsut's Mortuary Temple was on Luxor's west bank at a place now called Deir el Bahri, Arabic for Monastery of the North. Amenhotep I and Thutmose I's mortuary temples were probably dismantled to provide space for the lower terrace of Hatshepsut's monument. She called her new temple Djeser Djeseru, or Holy of Holies. The Djeser Djeseru was a ceremonial building, only used for special events. Built by SENENMUT, by then Hatshepsut's overseer of works, it was inspired by the nearby temple of Mentuhotep II. Constructed on 3 levels, which are reached by a set of long ramps, the temple contains many important scenes. Its entry road was lined with over 100 large sandstone sphinxes, each one adorned with Hatshepsut's head. 6 of these sphinxes have survived, 2 of which are intact, except for their uraeus cobras, which were carefully chiseled out. Here's the other intact sphinx. A scene on the wall behind the first level's southern colonnade shows an obelisk on a barge being towed by dozens of large ships. This obelisk was the one of 2 erected in the WADJET Hall at Karnak. Weighing some 700,000 pounds, 94 feet high, and carved from a single block of granite, these huge monoliths were quarried and moved 133 miles from ASWAN to Karnak, and then stood up and balanced on pedestals in the temple. An amazing feat of engineering. Notice that the early drawing below filled in the missing middle of the boat with 2 obelisks back to back. But the more recent drawing above clearly shows the obelisks side by side. So which one is correct? This model of Hatshepsut's obelisk transportation barge, made by ESS member John McGann, answers the question of how the obelisks were positioned. The pink granite stone used to make the model's obelisk was collected in the ASWAN quarry, the same quarry where Hatshepsut's Karnak obelisk came from. Since this is a scale model, calculated from the actual height of Hatshepsut's obelisks and the relative size of the men on the barge drawing, you can see that the obelisks must have been placed side by side in order to fit on the barge. On the second level are scenes of a voyage in year 9 to the land of Punt. The lower courtyard was originally planted with incense trees brought back from Punt. Hatshepsut's expedition to Punt consisted of 5 ships, 70 feet long, propelled by sail, and 30 rowers. Among the ship's company were an additional 60 soldiers and scribes who recorded the flora, fauna, and inhabitants of Punt. In 2008, a replica ship was built and tested, and found to be seaworthy. Here's an artist's impression of the Egyptians meeting the king and queen of Punt. The ships returned laden with exotic animals, ivory, electrum, and incense trees. The remains of the incense trees brought from Punt can still be seen in the courtyard of Hatshepsut's temple today. It's now known that the fleet sent by Hatshepsut left from the port of Sawu, near the modern Egyptian city of Qusir on the Red Sea. The port was reached via the Wadi Hammamat, which begins at the Qena Bend on the Nile and leads to the Red Sea. It's some 1,300 miles from Sawu to the coast of Somalia, a sea journey that would have taken a couple of months each way. Scholars have debated the location of Punt for the last 100 years. Most agree it was somewhere between Djibouti and the Horn of Africa. This is reinforced by a text from the 26th dynasty that says, "When rain falls on the mountains of Punt, the Nile floods." Most likely, the land of Punt consisted of trading ports on the Somali coast. Berbera is a good candidate, as it was recorded as a major trading center during the time the Ptolemies ruled Egypt. In ancient times, the climate was much wetter in this area. Frankincense and myrrh trees grew on the slopes up to the highlands, and rivers connected the coastal cities to inland trading centers. Hatshepsut's voyage to Punt was led by her bearer of the royal seal, Nehesi. This scene from Hatshepsut's temple shows Nehesi in the land of Punt. Inside the pavilion in the upper right, it says, and I quote, "Preparing the canopy of the royal messenger and his expedition in the slopes of Antu by the sea banks to receive the nobles of these lands," end quote. The lower register says, quote, "Arrival of the royal messenger and his expedition in the presence of the nobles of Punt, dispatched with all good things to trade for the sake of the life, prosperity, and health of her majesty," end quote. Here's the name of Punt, literally P-W-N-T, Punt. To justify her worthiness to be a living god, Hatshepsut recorded the story of her immaculate conception in a birth scene on the north side of the second level. She claimed that her father was in reality the god Amun, who came to her mother's bed disguised as Thutmose I. It's a story that would be told over and over again in an attempt to legitimize the rule of kings who were not in the direct line of succession. The Hathor Chapel at the Djeser Djeseru originally had its own entrance ramp from the first level. The Hathor Chapel's courtyard has a hypostyle hall with 12 Hathor-headed capitals. In the chapel's shrine, Hatshepsut was shown nursing at the udder of Hathor in her cow goddess form. In the New Kingdom, the beautiful Feast of the Valley celebrated the goddess Hathor receiving the dead into the afterlife. During this festival, Amun's bark would visit Hathor's chapel at the Djeser Djeseru before being carried up to Amun's own sanctuary on the next level above. Here's what the chapel looked like when photographed in 1907. Hathor was the goddess of love, joy, and celebration. She was sometimes shown in the form of a cow, but as a consort of Re, she's usually shown as a woman wearing a headdress of cow's horns and a sun disk. The shrine of the Hathor Chapel has been moved to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The north end of the second level is the Chapel of Anubis. It has 12 fluted columns in its hypostyle hall and a ceiling covered with stars. Anubis was, of course, the god of embalming and mummification. Anubis is actually the Greek pronunciation of his Egyptian name, In-pu. Two sphinxes depicting Hatshepsut with a lion's mane were originally placed on newel posts at the top of the ramp leading up to the second level. The style of these sphinxes is from the Middle Kingdom. Remains of pigment shows this one was painted yellow, the color used for women in Egyptian art. Two statues of Horus grace the bottom of the ramp leading up to the third level. They guard either side of the ramp and originally protected Hatshepsut's name, Ma'at Ka-Re, which was carved on the bird's chest. On the third level, colossal statues of Hatshepsut fronted the colonnade. Originally, 26 large Osiride statues of Hatshepsut stood in front of the pillars. These statues are similar to those erected in the WADJET Hall at Karnak by Thutmose I. On either side of the third level colonnade are the Royal Cult Chapel and the Sun Cult Chapel. In between is an open-air court flanked by columns. Behind the open court is the Sanctuary of Amun. The Royal Cult Chapel is dedicated to the ancestors of Hatshepsut. There are scenes showing Hatshepsut, her father Thutmose I, and her grandmother Senenmut. Also on the third level is the Sun Cult Chapel, dedicated to the worship of the solar deities Re-Herakti and Amun-Re. It consists of 2 rooms, the Chapel of the Night Sun's Journey and an open solar court. Here's what the open solar court originally looked like. In the center of the third level is a rock-cut shrine, shown in the left photo, called She-Netcher, or Divine Booth in ancient Egyptian. It was the resting place of Amun's bark when he visited the temple. 2 other chambers in the sanctuary, shown on the right, depict Hatshepsut, NEFERURE, and Thutmose III worshiping various gods. In addition to her building projects, Hatshepsut claims she restored festivals and celebrations following a period of ignorance of religious matters. During her reign, the processional routes widened and formalized were the beautiful Feast of the Valley, the Procession of Amun, and the OPET festival. During the annual Beautiful Feast of the Valley, Heb, Nefer, and Enet, the bark carrying Amun's statue was transported across the Nile in his barge, a 67-foot-long boat adorned with gold and precious metals. Amun's procession then proceeded to the Djeser, where the god was venerated in his shrine. Ordinary citizens participated by honoring their ancestors in the various tomb chapels on the West Bank. Celebrations honoring the dead continued throughout the night. It was just another excuse to party. To give you an idea what it must have looked like, here's how artist Mark Milmore envisioned the god's barge docking on the West Bank. It's a very pretty picture. The annual procession of Amun to what's now called the Small Temple of Amun of Medinet Habu was a celebration of the first act of creation. During Hatshepsut's reign, it was believed that this was the place where the first land emerged out of the primordial waters. At that time, the huge temple of Ramses III, just to the west, had not yet been built. Hatshepsut seems to have initiated the annual OPET festival, called in Egyptian Heb, Nefer, and Epet. The festival was held to commemorate the marriage of Amun and Mut. The celebrations lasted for 3 weeks. During this festival, statues of Amun, Mut, and their son Khonsu were carried in their holy barks from their temples of Karnak to LUXOR Temple. The carved relief decoration on the Red Chapel's exterior included scenes of the OPET festival. Hatshepsut built an avenue, later lined with thousands of sphinxes, between the Karnak and LUXOR temples for the OPET festival procession. Recently, it was cleared of buildings and debris that had accumulated over the centuries, and on November the 25th, 2021, the restored 2-mile-long avenue lined with sphinxes was reopened with a huge celebration reenacting the OPET procession. Along the processional route were 6 way stations. These small buildings had a central altar on which the god's bark was placed. At the way stations, the priest could rest while the god received offerings before moving on to the next shrine. Here, Hatshepsut is offering to Amun-Re. The text says, Ma'at Ka-Re, the good god, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, daughter of Re, Hatshepsut, united with Amun, given life forever. The northwest corner of LUXOR Temple is the triple bark shrine for the Theban triad of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. Originally built by Hatshepsut, it was the destination of the sacred barks during the OPET festival journey to LUXOR Temple. In the Montu precinct on the north side of Karnak is a small temple built by Hatshepsut, which was dedicated to the goddess Ma'at. It was recorded that Hatshepsut was crowned in this temple. Ma'at was the goddess of cosmic order, and of course the one venerated in Hatshepsut's throne name, Ma'at Ka-Re. Several significant building projects at Karnak were completed during Hatshepsut's reign. Her sandstone 8 pylon was the first of the pylons added to the southern processional route to facilitate the OPET procession. On the pylon's southern side, statues were erected of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, and Amenhotep I, with his wife Ames Nefertari. The missing statue on the right was probably originally of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut's original decoration is now mostly lost, as it was subject to a series of recarvings by later pharaohs. In Karnak's central area, Hatshepsut built a set of sandstone rooms now called the Palace of Ma'at. The walls of these rooms were covered with carved and brightly painted relief scenes of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Here's a depiction of Hatshepsut in the Palace of Ma'at. Just to the right and above her figure, you can see her now partially erased cartouche, Hatshepsut, and united with, have been chipped away, leaving only Amun's name. And across the left column are the words Nasut, kingship, with all of the text erased afterwards. The walls of the palace of Ma'at were covered with carved and painted relief scenes of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, like this scene from the Red Chapel. Other reliefs show King Hatshepsut celebrating her Hebsed Jubilee and offering to each of the 9 creation gods of Thebes. In front of the palace of Ma'at, Hatshepsut erected a 2-room bark shrine, now called the Red Chapel. Its ancient Egyptian name was Sed Ib Imen Amun, the place of the heart of Amun. Depictions on its walls include Hatshepsut being crowned, processions during religious festivals, and scenes of NEFERURE as the god's wife of Amun. Here, Hatshepsut is being crowned by Amun and Mut. In this scene, Hatshepsut is celebrating her Hebsed Jubilee. During the Hebsed, the king was rewarded with the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. Then, a ritual course was run before the king was carried away to visit the chapels of the gods of Upper and Lower Egypt. It was a ceremony of renewal and rejuvenation to ensure the kings could continue to rule as they aged. The Hebsed was normally held after 30 years, but Hatshepsut celebrated hers in year 15 of her reign, perhaps because she added in the 15 years of Thutmose III's co-rule. Well, maybe. Another scene describes the erection of Hatshepsut's 2 obelisks in the WADJET hall. Obelisks are called teken in the ancient Egyptian language. According to her treasurer, Jehudi, these obelisks were totally covered with electrum, and the 2 lands are filled with their rays. Today, the southern one has fallen and it lies on its side. Text at the bottom of these obelisks record the celebration of Hatshepsut's Hebsed Jubilee. The top of the obelisk show either Hatshepsut or Thutmose III offering to Amun-Re. Hatshepsut erected a 3rd pair of obelisks east of Karnak Temple. The raising of these obelisks was overseen by Senenmut, who's shown here holding Hatshepsut's daughter NEFERURE. Inscriptions claim these obelisks were covered in gold. But today, here's all that's left of Hatshepsut's eastern obelisks. Hatshepsut also extensively renovated the WADJET hall, originally built by Thutmose I. As well as adding her 2 Jubilee obelisks, she removed the stone columns, replaced them with gilded wooden papyrus pillars, and roofed over the hall with a wooden ceiling. Hatshepsut's Nedjeri Manu temple was located on the east side of Karnak. Thutmose III later dismantled the Nedjeri Manu to make room for his Akhmenu temple, and he put the disassembled blocks of the Nedjeri Manu in the Karnak cachette. The Nedjeri Manu is currently being rebuilt by French archaeologists in the open-air museum. The Nedjeri Manu contains scenes of Hatshepsut as regent and as God's wife of Amun, making offerings to various deities. There's also depictions of NEFERURE and a young king, Thutmose III, who later usurped the monument, claimed his own divine birth on its walls. So here's what Karnak looked like during Hatshepsut's reign. An amazing total of 6 huge obelisks were erected at Karnak during her rule. 2 ordered by Thutmose II before he died and placed by Hatshepsut in his festival court, 2 erected in the WADJET hall for her Jubilee festival, and 2 flanking Karnak's eastern gate. During the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, the Temple of Mut was built just south of Karnak. Hatshepsut's officials, Hapu-Seneb, her high priest of Amun, Pu-Emre, the second priest of Amun, and Jehudi, the overseer of the treasury, all described the installation of an ebony shrine at Mut's temple. Senenmut supervised the work, and his name was found on a gate excavated here. During Hatshepsut's reign, the festival of drunkenness, Heb Teket, was celebrated at Mut's temple to welcome the goddess Sekhmet with red-colored beer. In the myth of the destruction of mankind, to stop the slaughter of humanity, Sekhmet was given red-colored beer, which she lapped up thinking it was blood. She then passed out, and when she awoke, Sekhmet forgot her pledge to destroy the human race. The celebrants were recorded to have become so drunk they fell asleep in the temple's forecourt, to be awakened hours later for singing, dancing, and revelry, accompanied by sexual activity, as they awaited the goddess, perhaps the world's first orgy. In case you wish to hold your own celebration, the Festival of Drunkenness took place annually on the 20th day of the first month of Akhet, the flood season. So that's August the 8th in our calendar. You might even see Sekhmet if you drink enough. During her reign, Hatshepsut had many other monuments built throughout Egypt. These are the locations of some of them. Her builders were kept very busy. Like Ramses II, she should also be called a great builder. Now let's look at the court officials who held positions of authority during the joint reign of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Many of these officials began their careers under Thutmose II. I'll briefly outline the careers of each. Senenmut, Hatshepsut's best-known official, boasted in his inscriptions, and I quote, "I was a dignitary whom one listened to. My lady repeated favors for me. God's wife, Hatshepsut, may she live. She has made me great. She has made me excellent, and I was promoted to the front of officials, for she has recognized my excellence upon her heart." End quote. No modesty there. Senenmut seems to have remained a bachelor his entire life. Examples given are his portrayal alone in his funerary stele, his depiction alone in chapter 110 from the Book of the Dead, and it was his own brother, not a son, who performed Senenmut's funerary rites. Some Egyptologists have theorized that Senenmut was Hatshepsut's lover. A fact cited to support this theory is that she allowed Senenmut to place his name and image in her mortuary temple. In fact, over 60 representations of Senenmut have been discovered in the Jezero. This scene in the temple shows Senenmut venerating Hatshepsut's cartouche. Senenmut's inscriptions tell us that Hatshepsut appointed him to supervise her construction work at the Jezero and at the Amun, Mut, and Luxor temples. On a statue in the left picture, Senenmut is shown with a measuring cord, emphasizing his work as a surveyor and a builder. On this statue, Senenmut offers to Renutet, the harvest goddess. Senenmut certainly profited from Hatshepsut's rise in status during her joint reign with Thutmose III. His new title became Imi Ar Per-Wer, or Chief Steward of the Great House. During his lifetime, Senenmut collected more than 100 important titles, and although he never held the position of vizier, in practice he was far more influential than Hatshepsut's vizier Usir-Amun. The highest title he attained was Imi Ar Per-Wer Amun, Chief Steward of Amun's temple. Senenmut had a tomb dug near the first courtyard of the Jezero. Its entrance is shown here by the red arrow. Evidence suggests it was constructed in year 16 of Hatshepsut's reign. Senenmut's tomb has 3 chambers linked by a gradually descending step corridor. The ceiling of the first chamber shows astronomical calculations for the night sky. The second and third chambers were undecorated, but it does not appear this tomb was ever used for a burial. In addition to his burial tomb at Deir el Bahri, Senenmut also had a separate tomb chapel constructed in the nearby cliffs at Gurna. Strangely, within Senenmut's tomb chapel, the remains of a smashed quartzite sarcophagus were found in 1936. However, there was no trace of a mummy. And just below Senenmut's tomb chapel was found the intact tomb of his parents, Ramose and Hat-Nefer, whose grave goods are now on display in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. Here's a scene from the tomb of Amenhotep, Hatshepsut's chief steward, showing a scribe recording the catching of fish. Amenhotep left graffiti at Sahel Island near Aswan, commemorating his supervising in the quarrying of Hatshepsut's WADJET obelisks. Also, as chief works in the House of Granite, Amenhotep was in charge of quarrying the stone used for the Red Chapel. He says that he was awarded silver, gold, and a favor from her for his efforts. Usir-Amun, the mayor of Thebes and son of Thutmose II's vizier Amethu, was appointed vizier of the south in year 5 of the joint reign of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. He held this position for the next 27 years. During at least part of this time, the vizier of the north was his brother Neferuere. Usir-Amun had 2 tomb structures in the Theban hills, a T-shaped burial tomb and a tomb chapel, shown in this picture. His tomb chapel had a pyramid built on top of it. It's now been reduced to rubble. Hapu-Seneb was the high priest of Amun during Hatshepsut's reign between years 2 and 16. He left a shrine at Gebel el-Silsila, in between those of Senenmut and Nehesi. It shows his family giving offerings to a seated statue of King Hatshepsut. And this statue of Hapu-Seneb was given by Hatshepsut and placed in Amun's temple at Karnak. Pu-Emre was assistant to High Priest Hapu-Seneb. He was responsible for the construction of Hatshepsut's now destroyed Valley Temple at Deir el Bahri. Puemre's wife was the daughter of High Priest Hatshepsut. Just like in America today, it seems that nepotism and cronyism was common practice in ancient Egypt. In the top picture from Puemre's tomb, foreigners bring tribute to Amun's temple. In the bottom scene, papyrus is harvested and loaded onto a boat. Jehudi rose from royal scribe to become Hatshepsut's treasurer, a title he held until his death in year 20 of her reign. Texts in his tomb mention that he was in charge of recording the items brought from PUNT, and that he was in charge of the craftsmen who decorated in gold Amun's barge in both the Karnak and Djeser temples. Jehudi also tells us he was in charge of the construction of the Red Chapel and erecting Hatshepsut's Jubilee obelisk in the WADJET hall. Another important position Jehudi held was overseer of the king's gold and silver houses. This must have been a bit like being given the assignment to run Fort Knox, but without any alarms or modern security devices. Can't you just picture Jehudi sitting day and night in the treasury with one of those curved Kepesh swords saying, "Go ahead, make my day." Here's an illustration showing Hatshepsut and Thutmose III being presented with trade goods from PUNT. Her reign was very successful with much accomplished, and she left a great legacy for her co-ruler Thutmose III, who would continue to rule for the next 23 years. But no one lives forever, and kingship passed on to Thutmose III in her regnal year 22, second month of Peret, 10th day, but in our calendar, January 16, 1458 BCE. She was buried in tomb KV 20 beside her father, Thutmose I. For whatever reason, she moved her father inside his 3 nested coffins into her old sarcophagus and had another sarcophagus made for her own burial. She would have been buried with a full complement of grave goods, but unfortunately the only object that has survived is her canopic box, which contained a mummified liver and a tooth. Her mummy subsequently disappeared, and it's only recently been identified as the mummy designated KV60A, found in the tomb of Hatshepsut's nurse Sitre. Zahi Hawass matched the molar tooth from one of Hatshepsut's canopic boxes to a missing molar in the KV60A mummy and declared it was Hatshepsut. Results of DNA testing on the tooth and mummy, however, have not yielded definitive results. So until a positive match is obtained, whether or not this really is Hatshepsut is still undetermined. What is known is not only was her tomb plundered and her mummy lost, her entire reign was systematically erased, beginning at about Thutmose III's year 42. This scene from the palace of Ma'at shows Hatshepsut's name and images as king were attacked. However, her name and images as queen were left alone. Later kings chronicled the father to son lineage, Thutmose I to second to third, eliminating any record of her joint rule. I think they believed no woman should ever be king, and erasing her reign would restore cosmic order to the universe. Now that you've gotten to know Hatshepsut a bit better, let's look at who she wasn't. She wasn't the wicked stepmother that early Egyptologists thought she was. After all, she prepared Thutmose III to become king, provided for his education, gave him control of the army, and shared power with him. Hardly the actions of a wicked stepmother or an evil queen. Another Victorian slander on her name claims she was a seductress who had an illicit affair with SENENMUT, her hapless chief minister, who was hardly in a position to object to her whims of her sexual advances. Well, again, shame on you, Mr. 19th century Egyptologist. So what if she took on SENENMUT as a lover? Male pharaohs had multiple wives, concubines, and slaves to satisfy their urges. How many women did Ramses II favor with his charms? 50, 100, more? And the idea that Hatshepsut bossed Thutmose III around like an errant child is absurd. Thutmose was commander of the army during her rule, a trained killer, a brilliant strategist, and a legendary leader. He's been called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Can you imagine Napoleon submitting to his mother's orders and allowing her to sit on his throne and run France? So why would Thutmose III? It's not likely. So what was she really like? This princess who became a queen and then a king. Her achievements were many, her subjects were loyal, and Egypt prospered under her rule. Thutmose III, her ward since a toddler, willingly shared power with her, and for many years afterwards, Thutmose preserved her memory until his son became his co-regent successor. We'll probably never know the reason her monuments were attacked and her name as king erased, but one thing is clear, she was an amazing woman. And by the way, this artist forgot something. So let's close by remembering her name. Hat, foremost of, Shepsut, noble ladies, Kenemet, united with, Amun. Ma'at, truth, Ka is the soul of, Re. Jet, given life forever, Hatshepsut. Here's her family tree. Kings are in blue and their wives are in green. And here's some excellent reference books if you'd like to learn more about Hatshepsut's life. Hatshepsut from Queen to Pharaoh is the museum catalog for the 2006 Hatshepsut exhibition, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Edited by Dr. Catherine Roehrig, it has many chapters written by well-known Egyptologists. Hatshepsut, a 1998 publication by Dr. Joyce Tildesley, reader in Egyptology at the University of Manchester, and The Woman Who Would Be King, published in 2014 by Dr. Kara Cooney, professor of Egyptian art at UCLA. Thank you.